Ms Jugg.
Thank you, my lady. The next witness is Caroline Lamb.
Can you repeat after me? I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Ms Lamb, Ms Freeman told me it was the 6th time she's given evidence. What is it for you?
6 as well.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Can you confirm your full name, please?
Yes, Caroline Sarah Lamb.
Thank you for coming again for your 6th time to assist the inquiry. You've produced 2 witness statements for this module. The first is the corporate statement for the Director General of Health and Social Care, which is that INQ 000614179. And the second one is on behalf of the Chief Nursing Officer Directorate. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And that's the INQ 000614180.
Yep.
You are currently the Director General of Health and Social Care. Is that right?
That's correct.
And also the Chief Executive of the National Health Service in Scotland.
Yes.
And you've been in that dual role since the 21st of January 2021.
Yes. I think it might have been the 11th of January, actually.
11th of January, thank you. And is it right that the Director General of Health and Social Care is responsible for the Health and Social Care Directorates within the Scottish Government?
That's
also
correct.
referred to as the Director General Health and Social Care Family.
That's
or can
correct,
I call
yes.
it the DGHSC family for short?
Yeah.
Thank you. The Health and Social Care Directorates have responsibility for health policy, social care policy, public health and the administration of the NHS, and this includes setting the standards for governance in NHS Scotland.
That's correct.
Could you very briefly set out a summary of your relevant professional career prior to your appointment as the Director General of Health and Social Care, please?
Yeah.
In particular, focusing on any experience that you have in adult social care, please.
Yes, so I qualified as a chartered accountant. I worked for a while in the profession. My first job out of the profession was Director of Finance in a housing association, which was also involved in the provision of adult social care to residents in its accommodation. From there, I moved to the University of Abertay, where I was Director of Finance and then University Secretary. I then moved to NHS Education for Scotland, initially as Director of Finance and then became Chief Executive there before moving on a secondment to Scottish Government in December 2019. And I took up my current role, as you said, in January 2021.
Thank you very much. Do you have a view on whether there should be a permanent adult social care directorate?
So I think that what's really important is that we recognise the connections across health and social care. It's a single system. No bit of that system functions really well without all bits of the system working well together. And so the Director General that I head up is Director General of Health and Social Care. And within that group of directorates, we have a directorate that is focused on social care, as well as directorates that are focused more on the performance of the NHS, for example.
What about whether there should be a permanent minister for adult social care only?
So we do have a minister whose responsibility is for adult social care.
Sorry, I mean Cabinet Secretary.
So the Cabinet Secretary encompasses health and social care. And again, I think that's because of the whole system nature and the fact that in Scotland we have integrated joint boards and health and social care partnerships. So there's very much an attempt to see the system as one and to ensure that what we're doing works across the whole of the system.
Could I ask you to slow down just a little bit, please?
Sorry.
It's probably my fault for asking the questions very quickly at the beginning. Can I ask you this, please, Ms Lamb? During the pandemic, there were times when there were competing demands between the NHS in Scotland and the care sector, for example, in relation to discharge policy or access to PPE or access to testing. Given the NHS-facing role of the other part of your role, which is as Chief Executive of the NHS, Do you think it could be challenging in future during a pandemic for someone occupying that dual role to ensure that adult social care receives equal focus and priority, particularly when decisions involve competing demands?
I think that any position where you're trying to balance competing demands is difficult, but I think the advantage of having a Director General responsible for health and social care is that you have within your purview officials who can advise you both on health and on matters relating to the NHS, but also on matters relating to the social care system, and that through the interactions that we have, not just with NHS chief executives, but with the chief officers of our integrated joint boards, we're also linked into the system. So the systems are different, but I think that we have good mechanisms for understanding what the issues are and therefore trying as well as we can to balance out those priorities.
So is the answer that you don't think there needs to be? It's separate?
I think that there are disadvantages in separating out. I think that could lead to a more siloed approach where you were really just looking. If you were just responsible for one element, then I think it would be easier to be siloed and blinkered to some of the issues in other parts of the system. Thank you.
The inquiry understands that various working groups were set up during the pandemic, in particular the Clinical and Professional Advisory Group from April 2020. However, in relation to the rest of the care sector, I think that the CPAG originally only covered care homes. It was expanded later on to cover the wider sector in February 2021. Is that right?
I'm not sure I can remember the exact dates, but the advisory groups were put in place. So the Clinical Professional Advisory Group for Social Care, I think, did actually look across the whole of the sector. Initially, there was quite a heavy focus on the care home sector, but I think it was also looking at issues and concerns from the whole of the social care system.
Do you think that unpaid carers or the care at home sector were overlooked in comparison to care homes?
I don't think that they were overlooked. I think that you're right that there was a focus on care homes, particularly in the early parts of the pandemic. But I do think that the Scottish Government was also very aware of issues being raised by the care at home sector and also by unpaid carers. So again, I think as a result of the Carers Act 2016, we had well-developed mechanisms for consulting with representatives of unpaid carers. And in fact, we were pretty early as we expanded our provision of PPE. We expanded that not just to the care home sector, but to the care at home sector and also to unpaid carers as well.
Thank you. Just very quickly on that point, how were you able to identify, I think you expanded the PPE provision to personal assistants and services that weren't registered. How were you able to identify them?
So that was one of the challenges in being able to identify, because personal assistants, you'll be aware, can be employed in many different ways. They might be self-employed, they might be employed by an individual. So one of the challenges was actually identifying those people. But one of the things I think we did was to try and make it clear in the guidance that we were putting out to not just to health boards and to our integrated joint boards, our health and social care partnerships, but also to GPs and others, that what were the mechanisms for people being able to come forward and to be able to sort of accredit themselves as being personal assistants.
Thank you. We understand that adult social care in Scotland is delivered by a wide range of partners. Do you think that the government had sufficient oversight of all of that during the pandemic?
I think that from a Scottish Government perspective, we had a good understanding of the structure of the adult social care system, obviously through our integrated joint boards, health and social care partnerships, through our interactions with COSLA.
Can I just ask you to slow down a little bit, please?
Through our interactions with COSLA and also through representatives, people like Scottish Care and also the Coalition of Care Providers in Scotland. I think that probably in terms of oversight, our oversight in relation to the NHS is stronger because ministers are directly accountable for the NHS, whereas local authorities are have the statutory responsibility with regards to social care. And as you've said, there are multiple providers in the social care system. So I think that having oversight of those multiple partners was much more challenging, and having the data that would enable us to really understand that was more challenging as well.
Thank you. Can I ask you, please, about one particular aspect of the issue of leavers? You say in your statement that the Health and Care Staffing Scotland Act 2019 received royal assent in June 2019, but it didn't come into force until April 2024. Can you just briefly explain what levers have been conferred by that legislation coming into force, insofar as relevant to the staffing of the adult social care sector is concerned, and whether those powers would have been helpful to have had during the pandemic, please?
So the staffing, the legislation that you refer to covers both health and social care.
So just focusing on the
focusing on social care, the legislation requires providers of social care to ensure that they have adequate staffing levels, having due mind to the nature of the service, the size of the service, the people who are receiving care from that service, and the nature of their needs as well. And it also requires the providers to make sure that those staff members are adequately trained as well. It provides powers for the Care Inspectorate to set out staffing methodologies to assist providers in establishing staffing ratios as an example. And it requires reporting to Parliament around staffing levels on an annual basis. So, as you've said, that Act was legislated for in 2019 and implemented in 2024. I think that had that Act been in place earlier, it might have improved our understanding of the levels of staffing and indeed the variance in relation to levels of staffing between different care providers as well.
And could I just ask you, when you say there's a requirement also to ensure that staff are adequately trained, does that include in IPC measures?
I don't think the Act is that specific, but I think we would certainly expect that, given that the National Infection Prevention Control manual is mandated, that would be one of the areas that is covered.
Thank you. The inquiry has heard evidence from Ms Freeman that, in Module 2, she said that the Scottish Government's knowledge of and complete understanding of how the sector operated was not as adequate at the outset as they needed it to be. In your statement, you say that the Scottish Government had a deep understanding of the sector, both prior to and during the pandemic. Can you help us as to what you meant by that, please?
Yes, I think that partly relates to what I said earlier, is that I think that in the Scottish Government we had a number of mechanisms through dedicated policy officials whose role was to provide advice to ministers around social care, professional and clinical advisors, so our Chief Social Work Officer as an example, and through our links into local government, through COSLA, our links into the Integrated Joint Board, through chief officers. So we had a lot of structures in place to enable us to gather intelligence and to understand the adult social care sector. I think that what Ms Freeman referred to in her evidence is that within a sector that is as diverse as the adult social care sector, there is a lot of variability in relation to, I think the example she quoted was around the use of the National Manual on Infection Prevention Control. So there's a lot of variability, and I don't think that we had fully understood the extent of that variability.
Thank you. In your statement, you refer to the four harms approach, harm one being direct health harms as a result of COVID, and harm 2 being broader health harms, primarily the impact on the effective operation of the NHS and social care associated with large numbers of patients with COVID-19 and its knock-on effects on the treatment of illness. Do you think that enough data was gathered on harm 2 as opposed to harm 1 during the pandemic? So the indirect impact on social care, including the people receiving it?
I think that probably our data gathering improved as the pandemic went on, and certainly as we sought to use that four harms methodology to assess policy decisions. But I think at the outset of the pandemic, and again down to the sort of diverse and diffuse nature of the social care sector, it was far easier for us to assess the indirect impact on health services through, for example, the stepping down of planned care than it was to assess that indirect impact on social care services.
You've talked about perhaps knowledge of the variants not being adequate. Do you think that the information sources available to ministers and the government during the pandemic of matters on how the sector was operating on the ground was sufficient?
No, I don't. I think at the outset of the pandemic, there were a number of data gaps that we identified. And sought to address those by putting in place additional data collection measures, for example, the safety huddle tool. And I think a clear example I could quote there was around staffing and staff absences. So whereas for NHS services, there's a single payroll, a single time recording system, we were able to get daily details on staff absences. There was nothing comparable to that in the social care system. And one of the things the safety huddle tool was used to collect was that data on staff absences. So staffing data was collected in the social care sector, but not on a sort of daily or even weekly or monthly basis. And there was quite a time lag between the collection of that data and then being able to report on it, none of which was what we needed when it came to the pandemic.
We know that you engaged with a range of stakeholders, which included, for example, provider, organisation representative groups. In terms of the breadth of information sources available, do you think that the voice of care home residents and their loved ones, and also unpaid carers and personal assistants, was loud enough within the government?
I think that ministers were always very keen to understand issues from the perspective of the people receiving services and their loved ones. But were those voices loud enough, particularly at a time when things were developing very quickly and we were having to make decisions very quickly? I think there's probably always improvements that you can make in terms of engaging with those groups. But that said, there were regular meetings. Scottish Care and others were represented around the table at many of the groups that were set up to provide that sort of input into decision making. And as I've said, we had links into unpaid carers, and a network was through that as well. But I'm sure there is always more that can be done in that respect.
So the answer may be obvious, but do you think, on reflection, that had you had a broader cross-section of the sector in those meetings, that the government would have been assisted in its decision-making? I think that we did have quite a broad cross-sector in those meetings. I think it was also not the case that there was always a consensus in those meetings, and that I'm sure a lot of the decisions that we made, as you will have heard already, were about balancing up different levels of risk and trying to reach the right decision. So certainly we were hearing a number of different voices, and those voices were not always in agreement. And so I think that the process of decision-making was helped by understanding those range of agreements, but there was never a single sort of definitive source that you could use. Can I ask you about the discharge policy, please?
Yep.
We know that guidance was issued on the 13th of March 2020, which accompanied the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport's letter to the sector. Do you know whose decision it was that care homes or the residents in the care home should be socially distanced? And by that I mean that visits would be restricted to essential visits only and that residents would be isolated in their rooms.
So I'm not sure. So that guidance, the guidance that was issued on the 13th of March, I believe, was issued by it was like the Scottish Government clinical guidance you're talking about.
So there was guidance issued by Health Protection Scotland on the 12th of March.
Yeah, and then the 13th.
And then on the 13th of March, the Scottish Government issued guidance which is based on the Health Protection Scotland guidance, but issued the next day along with a letter from Jean Freeman.
Yeah, so that's the clinical guidance. So HPS, Health Protection Scotland, issued guidance which was around sort of health protection aspects, and then it was recognised that there was additional clinical guidance needed. In terms of what was in that guidance, that was based on the best evidence and the best advice from clinical advisors within the Scottish Government, including the Chief Medical Officer, who was in discussion with other Chief Medical Officers across the UK. So the advice came together based on all those clinical factors being taken into account.
Do you know what was intended by the definition of essential visits in that guidance?
So my understanding is that in the definition of essential visits was in line with the definition that we adopted for hospitals, which was around end-of-life visits being deemed essential, but also if residents were distressed, then that would be deemed an essential visit as well, if that could alleviate their distress.
I think it was slightly broader than that on the 13th of March, and then it was narrowed down to
Right.
those on the 26th of March. Can you help us any further with that?
I'm sorry, without having it in front of me, I can't.
Thank you. Your statement explains that the guidance was issued urgently following a submission on the 11th of March about care homes closing their doors to hospital discharges. Do you know whether any thinking had been done by the government in advance of the 11th of March about social distancing measures or about visiting restrictions in care homes?
So I think that so there were a couple of things that happened in the run-up to that guidance being issued. In February, there was a resilience meeting that involved social care providers that had originally been set up to deal with resilience issues that we thought would come around as a result of Brexit, but then was sort of rapidly repurposed to be a meeting to share information, share concerns, share intelligence around what was then the developing COVID pandemic. And in early March as well, COSLA held the first of their National Contingency Group meetings. So I think both of those, the thinking then was starting to emerge about the best way in which to protect people. And certainly I think perhaps inevitably, I'm not a clinician, but I think inevitably when you have a new infectious disease, one of the measures that you can use to try and protect people from that is ensuring that they're not that their close contact with people who may be infectious is limited.
Did the government carry out any investigation to see if they could establish whether care homes could in fact isolate residents in their room, or whether there was any suggestion of drawing up a list of care homes with isolation facilities?
So this wasn't about separate isolation facilities. This was about the advice being provided to isolate people, as you said, in their own rooms. We didn't carry out any research as to which care homes had what sort of facilities, but it was always a choice for care homes in relation to taking admissions.
Do you know if any inquiries were made for assurance purposes that about the care inspectorate ratings of care homes? So was any thought given to the risks of discharging patients into care homes that had less adequate ratings, for example?
So my understanding is that standard practice at an individual health and social care partnership level would be to consider the ratings of care homes before making decisions about where to place residents who are needing to be placed in care homes.
Are you able to help us, please, as to why the guidance advised that all care home residents should be isolated, regardless of whether the care home was accepting admissions from hospital or the community, and where they were located or what types of care homes they were?
So my understanding, I think, would be that the advice to isolate residents would be to recognise that the risk, there was a risk of infection coming in, not just from new people being admitted, but from staff coming in and out of the care home as well. And that's why infection prevention control measures were so important.
Do you know how long it was anticipated that those measures would be in place for?
I don't, because that would depend on how long it was before the pandemic eased, before we had a vaccination, and I don't think any of us knew any of that at that point.
Do you know if any impact assessments were ordered or carried out in relation to the measures?
So I would imagine that at that point there was simply not the time to carry out impact assessments.
Do you know if any work was done prior to the guidance being issued on alternatives to those measures? So, for example, step-down facilities. So for hospital discharges, whether they could have spent some time isolating in step-down facilities before they went into care homes?
So I think that standard practice would be when people are being discharged from hospital, if those people are unable to be discharged back to their private individual home, that there will be consideration of whether a step-down facility is the most appropriate place for them to go to, and taking into account availability. I don't recall us having particular. I think there was some discussion at one point of whether we could provide additional capacity through hotels or anything else, but I think that was discounted, both in terms of the additional disruption to individuals, but also in relation to having to staff additional facilities and make sure that those facilities complied with everything you would require to see when you're looking after older or vulnerable people.
In your statement, you say that no financial support was offered directly to care homes at the time that the guidance was published. Do you know why that was?
Well, at the time the guidance was published, I'd say that guidance was being published rapidly to respond to a rapidly developing pandemic. Any financial decisions have to go through a process of establishing what it is that we're offering assistance for, how we ensure that represents best value for the public purse, how we make sure that the money is distributed appropriately. So there was financial assistance to care homes, but and that was backdated, but we had to work through all the mechanisms of setting that out and working with COSLA, because that assistance was provided via local authorities. So that process was worked through, but it couldn't be done at exactly the same time as the guidance was issued.
The inquiry understands that supplies of PPE were low at this stage, but bearing in mind that the submission of the 11th of March had indicated that some care providers were finding it difficult to source PPE, was any consideration given to providing care homes with PPE supplies or asking the NHS to provide PPE alongside patients who are being discharged into care homes?
Yeah, so as you heard in Module 5, I think it was, National Services Scotland procures PPE on behalf of the whole of the NHS in Scotland and also manage the pandemic stockpile. And so from early March, possibly earlier than that, there were discussions with National Services Scotland about releasing stock from the pandemic stockpile, but also a memorandum of understanding was signed with NSS so that they could take on the distribution of PPE stock to social care as well. I think that was around about the 15th of March. And from then on, we set up, NSS established a social care helpline so that social care organisations who were experiencing difficulty, particularly where they had suspected or confirmed COVID cases, were able to get rapid deliveries. And then we went on to establish the PPE hubs, working with local authorities, so that not just social care organisations, but unpaid carers, care at home organisations, everybody could get access to through those.
Thank you. And if you could just focus on the time period we're looking at, which is when the guidance on the 13th of March was published. You make the observation in your statement that whilst not complete isolation, the guidance advised that communal activities should be reduced by 75%. In Ms Freeman's statement, she says that the mandatory isolation came in on the 26th of March. I think it may actually have been a bit later than that. Do you know when it came in? For hospital discharges, for mandatory isolation? My recollection was that it was in the 26th of March guidance, but I'm... And do you know why, in that case, on the 13th of March, there was no requirement for all hospital discharges to be isolated on arrival or at hospital before they came to the care homes? So I think that the 13th of March guidance was focused around social distancing. I don't know why why the mandatory isolation wasn't included at that point. Do you think it ought to have been, considering there was no testing of the hospital discharges and given what was known about the vulnerability of care home residents? So I think that, yes, I would accept that we probably should have been clearer about isolation in the guidance of the 13th of March. And I think it's important as well because isolation continued to be really important even after we had testing because of the possibility of false negatives. In the time between the 13th of March, when the guidance was first issued, and the 26th of March, when it was updated, did the Scottish Government receive any feedback about difficulties that care homes were having in implementing the isolation requirements or in accessing PPE? So I think Donald McCaskill from Scottish Care met with Ms Freeman, I think, on about the 18th of March, and she would have had, and officials would have had feedback from other areas as well, but I think Mr McCaskill was in that meeting able to be clear, and we would have had feedback from COSLA and others, that both around the difficulties that social care organisations were having in accessing PPE, which I've explained what we did to try and address that, and also around challenges of isolation as well. And what exact steps were taken by the government to ensure that it had oversight of the impact of hospital discharges on care homes? And that's focusing on this particular period in time, so between the 13th of March and the 26th of March. So I think in that period between the 13th and 26th, I think we were very reliant on the guidance that had been issued, and that we and you know the activities of our local health and social care partnerships. There wasn't anything else that we were able to do at that point in terms of oversight. In the event of a future pandemic, would the Scottish Government make any different decisions about the discharge of patients from hospital to care settings? So I think when we talk about discharges, I think we need to be really mindful of the fact that, first of all, it's really well established that being in hospital is not the best place for somebody who no longer has a clinical requirement to be in hospital. People decondition, they get confused, they deteriorate while they're in hospital. I think we also need to remember that, and I think it's in the PHS report, that quite a significant number of those people, about 46% from memory, of the people who were discharged from hospitals to care homes were discharged back to the care home that had been their place of residence before they went into hospital. And so I think it remains really challenging when you're facing a pandemic that is likely to
require you to use all of your hospital capacity to the extent that you're having to stand down other areas of care that are very important for people. Obviously, it's important that we free up hospital beds that are not required by the people who are in those beds, and many of whom will be going home rather than into care settings. I think if we were to think about what we would do differently, I think we need to maybe be even clearer than we were about the limitations of testing, the likelihood, the importance of maintaining a focus on infection prevention control and all the other mitigations you can put in place to try and ensure that people are kept safe in care settings.
Can we look at the visiting restrictions that are set out in the guidance, please? On the 25th of March, there was an email discussion involving the Chief Nursing Officer, and she was advised that most European countries had banned visits to care homes, and she was asked what she thought about the definition of essential visits only. I think in the 13th of March guidance, it had included named family contact, consideration in end-of-life situations, and suggested a risk assessment be carried out. The Chief Nursing Officer at the time, I think that was Fiona McQueen, said it was her preference that essential visiting should be restricted to end-of-life, and that was in accordance with what was being applied in hospitals. Do you know if that was a unilateral decision by her to narrow the definition of essential visits? Because you say in your statement that updated guidance was then issued on the 26th of March, so the next day.
I don't think there were any unilateral decisions. I think there was always a debate around weighing up different aspects of every decision. And I don't think either that we would have been unduly influenced by what other countries were doing, that we were always looking at what the situation was in Scotland and what the assessment was based on a range of clinical and other professional advisors, including, as I said, the Chief Social Work Officer.
Do you know whether anyone in the sector was consulted on that change of definition?
So I'm sorry, no, I can't say for certain.
Do you know if any impact assessments or equality assessments were carried out?
Again, I think at that point, the pace at which we were issuing guidance made it very, very difficult to carry out those sort of impact assessments.
And can you just help us, please, as to what Miss McQueen's professional experience was in the care sector as opposed to in the NHS?
I'm sorry. I think I'd need to go back to that. But she was a very experienced nurse.
It's right, isn't it, that in June 2020, guidance was issued which outlined a staged approach to supporting indoor visiting. However, a full return was not promoted until February 2021.
That's correct, yeah.
Did you have any accounts at the time that care homes were not opening their doors in accordance with the staged approach?
Yes, we did. And one of the ways in which we tried to address that, there are two ways, really. One is we use the safety huddle tool to gather information about the extent to which individual care homes were or were not allowing visitors and what they were doing. And that was then, the data from all of that fed into health and social care partnerships, so they could actually sort of contact the care homes and ask the questions. There was also a survey that we carried out to try and understand what the barriers were to allowing visiting, so to try and understand what were the things that were making care homes anxious, what were the things that were preventing them from allowing more visiting.
So some residents in care homes were effectively locked down for a year or longer. We know that Anne's Law was consulted on in 2021. Is it right that that's still not in force? And could you give us an update on the progress of that, please?
Yeah, so Anne's Law is part of the care reform Scotland bill, which was passed unanimously in the Scottish Parliament in June, just gone, June 2025, and is now waiting on royal assent.
The inquiries heard that it was a common complaint that guidance was often issued on a Friday, and there's a balance to be struck between issuing guidance as quickly as possible in a rapidly moving pandemic and also not causing unnecessary burden on an already strained workforce. Were you aware of the concerns in the sector?
Yes, we were. We had a workforce leadership group that met really regularly, and through that, we were advised that issuing guidance, probably particularly on a Friday. I mean, obviously the guidance was being issued rapidly, and there was a lot of it, but that particularly on a Friday, that was difficult. I think for us, we had to balance the need to get guidance with changes out as quickly as possible. With the understanding that was going to be challenging for those receiving it. I think in some cases guidance would the changes that were formalising the guidance would have already been well trailed, so they might have been announced in Parliament by the Cabinet Secretary or the First Minister. Where there were really more substantial changes, we also tried to put out additional guidance to support those needing to implement the guidance. So there were, videos, webinars, and more information. But I accept absolutely that there were times when guidance landed, probably on a Friday afternoon, and that wasn't a particularly helpful time for people to be receiving it.
The inquiries also received evidence that some of the staff are finding the guidance itself confusing. We've heard that there was guidance also issued by Health Protection Scotland, or Public Health Scotland as it became, on the one hand, and then Scottish Government guidance, which was based on the Health Protection Scotland guidance. Do you accept that could have been confusing for the sector? And do you think that the quality and timeliness of guidance improved with the increased input of the sector through the working groups and wider engagement?
Yes, absolutely. I think that you quoted an example earlier, where Health Protection Scotland issued guidance on the 12th of March and we issued clinical guidance on the 13th of March. And we moved quite quickly to having all that guidance issued by what was then Public Health Scotland. And the Scottish Government just then retained the responsibility for issuing guidance on things like face coverings that was more general. So I do accept that. I think that our processes by which we issued guidance, our processes for consulting with the sector, and therefore being able to adapt that guidance and make sure that the language was understandable and was appropriate for the sector. I think we improved all of that.
Can I ask about PPE, please? In Scotland, is it right that social care providers received PPE support from the government in two ways? First, by recouping pandemic-related PPE costs from the local authority via funding from the Scottish Government. And was it right that when that came into force, it allowed backdating of funding requests? And the second way was from March 2020, the national stock was provided free of charge for top-up and emergency provision where normal supply routes were unsuccessful.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, both those methods of support were used.
The inquiries received evidence from multiple sources about some of the challenges that people had in obtaining PPE, also about the quality of the PPE that they were able to access, and also issues regarding the fit of PPE. Was the government aware of those issues?
So I think we were aware that there were issues with the social care sector being able to use the supply methods that they'd used pre-pandemic, and that's why we asked National Services Scotland to step in there and ensure that the PPE that the social was that the social care sector were getting was sufficient, of a appropriate quality and appropriately fitting as well. So essentially we moved from pre-pandemic arrangements whereby local authorities would source PPE for their social care sector through the XL contract, and other independent private providers would have their own supply routes. We moved from that to a position where National Services Scotland was supplying the whole sector.
And if there was a pandemic tomorrow, how would the sector be supplied with PPE?
We would take exactly the same approach.
Thank you. Can I ask you about the enhanced system of assurance or oversight that came in April 2020, please? Could you tell us, please, what you think went well with that process and what you think could have been differently or can be improved in future?
Yeah, so the enhanced system of assurance was set up, led by directors of public health in every NHS board area, but with a really strong focus on bringing together multidisciplinary teams, so bringing together teams across nursing, across social care, across allied health professionals, GPs and others, to provide, the initial ask was for them to do a review of every care home within their geographical area, to bring together all the information and intelligence, so the care inspectorate was included on that as well, that they had, and then do a risk assessment and to then carry out a series of visits based on that risk assessment. So in terms of what worked well, I think it was a really good way of bringing together a range of different professionals, sometimes again with different views on things, but bringing them together to reach a consensus around the care homes that needed to be prioritised for visits. I think it gave Scottish Government and ministers greater assurance that when the teams went to visit care homes, they would look at things like staffing levels, they'd look at training around infection prevention control measures, how infection prevention control measures were actually being applied in reality, the amount of PPE and other things, and the general well-being of residents. So I think it worked well in that it gave ministers greater assurance in the areas that they'd accepted that they were limited in their assurance because of that variability across different providers. I think that we also recognised that there were some challenges in that approach as well. So there were challenges around whether this was whether the visits were about improvement and supporting the care homes to be able to be as good as they possibly could be, or whether they were inspection visits and therefore how that sat and rubbed up against the care inspectorate's role. And I think there was also different professional groups coming together is really powerful, but also they have different roles, different responsibilities and different views. So there was further work done and a guidance framework laid out for how to actually best practice in terms of that whole approach. And I think that if we were to be faced by that situation again, then I think that guidance would stand us in good stead in terms of actually being able to understand what were the things that created the difficulties in the early phases of that last time, and how we would approach that differently.
There was a varied approach amongst the health boards as to whether they took an inspection type approach or a more supportive role. Did you find that the ones that took a more supportive role were better received and had better outcomes?
I think that certainly some of the feedback, and I think Scottish Care carried out a survey of their members, and I think they felt that where that system worked really well, it was actually incredibly helpful, and where more of an inspection-focused approach happened, then that became quite confusing for the care homes to be able to understand what the difference was between what the oversight team was saying and what the care inspectorate was saying to them. So I think that, again, going forward, we need to be really clear about that role, and that it is about support to improve rather than an inspection.
Another issue that was raised about that process is that care homes were providing a lot of information that went into data analysis for public bodies and the government, but they weren't being shared that data themselves. So, for example, if there was an outbreak in their area, they didn't have the forewarning about that. Is data sharing with care homes something that you would recommend should happen in future if there's a pandemic?
Yes, I think that I appreciate that many care homes probably felt that there was an additional data burden imposed on them, and I've explained why that was necessary, because we didn't have, there weren't other systems through which we could get that data. What we tried to do is to make it that data collection as quick and easy as possible. It was a web-based system, so it didn't require lots of analysis. It would sort of produce graphs and everything else straight away. And it was certainly used through the local health and social care partnerships. And I would agree, yes, it should have been shared back with care homes as well, so that they could see what was happening in their area. And that's certainly, our approach with regard to social care data now, is to try and make that as visible as possible.
Thank you. Can I ask you about staff movement, please? Did the government ever consider legislating to prevent staff movement, and what consideration did it give, if so, to funding for the workforce?
So I don't recall that there was ever consideration of legislation, so there were lots of things that we put in guidance that would have taken a very long time to get through legislation, and obviously there was a requirement to act very quickly, and I think legislation of that sort would be incredibly complex as well. In terms of funding and support for the workforce, I think we did we did a number of things. So one of the things I think was that we recognised that the terms and conditions across the social care sector are variable and are not always as good as we would want them to be. We recognise that some employers would only pay statutory. If people were off sick, they would only be entitled to statutory sick pay. So we put in place arrangements to ensure that they could receive an amount equivalent to their normal pay, so they weren't suffering financially if they were off sick, or indeed if they had to isolate because a member of their family was off sick. We also put in place a number of sort of wellbeing supports. We had a national wellbeing hub to offer support, advice to people working across the sector, because it's an incredibly stressful time for people. Scottish Government has also consistently, since 2016, met the costs of ensuring that social care staff are paid the real living wage rather than just the minimum wage.
But just focusing on staff movement and what funding was considered in relation to that issue. Is there anything else that you want to add?
I can't think of anything else I'd add to that.
Thank you. And just very quickly, do you think that legislating staff movement is feasible? I think you described it as being very complex.
I think that would be very difficult, but I'm not a legal expert either.
We understand that the Scottish Government, or Scotland in fact, had a central register of care workers. Do you think that benefited Scotland in terms of the adult social care sector's response, and if so, how?
Yeah, so in Scotland, care workers are regulated by the Scottish Social Services Council. So we do have a register, and I think one of the ways in which that benefits the sector is that there are training requirements associated with being registered, and therefore I think that encourages people working in the sector, but also employers to support their staff in training as well.
Thank you. And before we end with what your top recommendation is, just one more short topic, please. Do you think that enough was done during the pandemic in relation to the issue of inequalities in Scotland?
No, I couldn't possibly say that. I think that Scotland has, in common with other parts of the UK, has a persistent issue with inequalities. I think that all the evidence would show that the pandemic has worsened rather than ameliorated those inequalities, and therefore I couldn't possibly say that there isn't more that we could have done.
And your top recommendation, please, in the event of a future pandemic?
Just one.
Well, how many top recommendations?
So I think that, first of all, I'd say that I think there's a number of things that we have done. We've talked about Anne's Law. Within that same legislation, we've made additional provisions around data sharing and information standards, which I think will really help us going forwards. And we've also legislated for breaks for unpaid carers. So I think there's a number of things that have already happened. I think that probably, though, we need, as the UK, really to look at the underlying resilience of the social care system. When you look at the demographics, this is a really important system for us, and I think it's hard to escape the fact that it's a sector that needs additional funding.
Thank you very much, Ms Lamb. My lady, those are all my questions. I understand that there's some questions from the call participants.
There are. Thank you very much, Ms John. Ms Mitchell, who's that way, as you may remember?
I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved, which you may remember from us asking you questions before. Just touching on the last point that you were asked there by my learned friend about recommendations. As we know, the Chair can make recommendations and it's for politicians to implement them. Do you have any suggestions which would be low cost but high impact in relation to planning for the next pandemic?
Low cost but high impact. I actually think that a lot of and I've explained that we've already done quite a lot around data, but actually I do think that having a better understanding, a more up-to-date understanding of what's actually happening across the social care system, and being able, therefore, to identify where there are variances and to understand whether those are warranted variances or whether there is additional support that could be provided to improve some services, is a relatively low cost, but I think it could be an incredibly high impact.
And what would you be looking for there when you're seeing the differentials? What sort of things would you be looking at?
So I think there's a number of things. If you look at our national the performance indicators for social care, which is a balance of what are the things that people can expect to receive. So I think it's looking at eligibility, so ensuring that people are getting the care packages and the support that they need, ensuring that they're being treated with dignity and respect, looking to see that care packages are the right sort of size for people, looking to see that staff are valued and well trained and well supported to do the best job that they possibly can. There's a whole range of indicators that I think we could use usefully.
So it's really using the data to either assure yourself that things are working properly, or where there aren't, identify where you can implement change.
Absolutely.
The next question I want to ask is probably just as broad, and it may be one that you've thought of before. Certainly other witnesses have given an indication that this is something that they've thought of. If you were given the opportunity to go back and change one thing that was done that would make great impact, what would that be and why?
I think that's a very broad question, and it's also an incredibly difficult one to
It's a bit like when did you stop beating your wife?
Yes.
It was premised on the basis that a number of witnesses have said this is one thing that could have been done, or we think this was the most important thing. I'm not suggesting that you discount all the rest, but I'm just saying if there is something that you think this could have been done differently, and here's how it would have been better had it been done differently.
I think that, so I wish that we had more testing capacity earlier, and I think also that we could have been much clearer in our guidance earlier as well.
And why would that be?
Because I think that there was still confusion, and I think maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's the wrong way to describe it. And being clearer, I think we could have provided more support to ensure that guidance was fully implemented in the way that it was intended to be.
My lady, those are my questions.
Thank you very much, Ms Mitchell. Ms Jones, who's over there.
Thank you, my lady. Ms Lamb, my question follows quite well from the answer that you've just given. I'm asking questions on behalf of John's campaign, Care Rights UK, and the Patients Association. Now, and our question is about the confusion that arose from the guidance that was published. You were asked by Ms Jung earlier what you understood the term exceptional circumstances to mean in the visiting guidance, and you referred to end of life being an exceptional circumstance in which visits should have been permitted under the guidance. But we know that there were real problems and inconsistencies with how different settings understood that term. So, for example, the organisations I represent are aware of some care homes taking a more liberal approach to that, but others interpreting end of life to mean the last days, the last hours, even in some cases the last minutes of someone's life, so that very often family members were not able to make it in time to be with their loved one when they died and were not there to provide support in the period leading up to that. And we even know of some cases where extremely upsettingly family members were let in and then were kicked out again when their loved one did not die as quickly as had been expected. So given these real inconsistencies and unpredictabilities in how the guidance was interpreted, can you clarify for the inquiry what you thought the definition of the end-of-life period was under the guidance? What was it intending to refer to and who should have been allowed in?
So my understanding was that if you read the guidance alongside the sort of person-centred approach to care, that should be the end of life, essential visiting at end of life should be an individual assessment based on the individual in front of you that provides the time and the space for them to be able to, for them and their loved ones to be able to spend time together as they approach the end of their life.
But did you consider that any time period was being put on that by the guidance?
I don't think so, no.
And so in circumstances then where it is a series of individual interpretations under the guidance applied to a particular person, what do you think would have been the way around the extremely unhelpful inconsistencies that arose in interpretation?
So I think if you sort of take a step back from that, what I explained about what we've done in Scotland around Anne's Law is to make sure that there is always a nominated essential visitor, which would avoid you having to get into is it days, is it hours, which is an incredibly difficult position to put not only those individuals in, but also care home staff trying to manage that.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Jones. Ms Beattie, who's just behind, I think. Yep.
Thank you. I ask questions on behalf of disabled people's organisations, and my questions also concern the visiting restrictions. You were asked some questions and answered them earlier about restricting those visits to essential visits. And you said that you understood that that was in line with the definition for hospitals, which again, as just mentioned, was around end-of-life visits and also if residents were distressed. How did the Scottish Government ensure that that restriction, those visiting restrictions, didn't prevent the continuation of vital health and clinical services to people in residential care settings, including, for example, visits by GPs?
Yeah, so I think there was a letter that was sent from the Chief Medical Officer to our GPs, and it was a follow-up around some of the concerns that have been raised with us about the inappropriate use of DNA CPRs. But there was a follow-up letter went out from the Chief Medical Officer, which also, I think, stressed the importance of GPs in providing care and support to the care homes in their locality. So there was that letter that went out. I think it was about the end of March. It might have been April. But also then once that system of enhanced monitoring was put in place, that was under the oversight of Directors of Public Health. That was also very much intended to ensure that care homes were well supported by general practitioners, by geriatricians in their local hospitals and others as well.
I think in your statement you say that initially the guidance said that essential visits might have to include visits by health and social
That's right,
staff.
and that was then corrected. So that was then adjusted in the next version of the guidance. I think that was felt to be a bit tight.
Right, and so obviously you weren't intending to prevent those
No,
kind of continuation.
absolutely not.
Is it the case, though, that concerns and reports that GPs and others weren't getting into care homes continued really right and up until and throughout 2020, such that a letter was still being sent even in April 2021, stressing to care homes that GPs can and should visit.
Yes.
So did that remain a concern despite that early correction?
Yes.
More than a year earlier.
Yes, so we had I think, attempted to correct the guidance. We had issued a letter, but yes, there did. Again, it's about the variability across the country that it was felt necessary to issue that further letter.
And are you aware of any checks or any auditing of whether that and those gaps, perhaps in residents receiving that kind of ongoing routine care in circumstances where there had been stops on visiting, whether those kind of clinical care visits had caught up?
I'm not aware of that, no.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Beattie. That completes the questions we have for you, Ms Lamb, and I'm pretty confident saying, and that completes the demands we're going to make upon you for this inquiry, although I suspect there are other inquiries that there'll be demands placed on you. But thank you for your help, and I'm sure the help of members of your team who helped provide the statement. So thank you, and safe journey back to Scotland.
Thank you very much.
Very well. I think that completes the evidence for today, and so I shall return at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
All rise.